Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled outside as Samantha stared out the frost-covered window of her family's cabin. The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, coating the trees and turning the forest into a ghostly white expanse. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls, but it wasn't enough to shake the chill creeping into her chest. December 31st. A date Samantha had grown to dread over the years. She had begged her parents to spend New Year's Eve somewhere else, anywhere but here. But tradition was tradition, and the cabin had been in their family for generations. The first strange thing happened just after dinner. As her father stacked the last of the dishes in the sink, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. Samantha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Just the storm," her mother reassured, lighting a candle. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled ever so slightly. Samantha knew better. She had grown up hearing the stories. The cabin, they said, had a history. On December 31st, 1899, a group of revelers had rented it to celebrate the turn of the century. By dawn, all of them were dead. The coroner's report blamed hypothermia and alcohol poisoning, but the locals whispered of a curse, a spirit that prowled the woods on New Year's Eve, seeking company for eternity. It wasn't until her younger brother, Jake, suggested they play a game that the tension in the room broke. He retrieved a dusty Ouija board from the attic, grinning mischievously. Samantha protested, but her parents, already tipsy on champagne, dismissed her concerns. "It's just a game," her father chuckled, sliding the planchette onto the board. They gathered around the coffee table, the firelight illuminating their skeptical yet amused faces. The first few questions were silly. Jake asked if he would grow up to be rich, and her mother giggled as the planchette spelled out "Eno." Samantha didn't participate, her unease growing with each passing minute. Then Jake asked, "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette stilled. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly it began to move. "Why, yes." Samantha's heart raced. "You're pushing it," she accused Jake, her voice sharp. "I'm not," he insisted, his wide eyes betraying genuine fear. Her mother laughed nervously. "All right, that's enough for tonight." But the planchette moved again, faster this time. 8 yelp. "Stop it, Jake," Samantha shouted, shoving away from the table. "I swear I'm not doing it," he yelled back, his voice cracking. Before anyone could react, the front door burst open with a deafening bang, sending icy wind and snow swirling into the room. The fire guttered, plunging them into near darkness. Her father slammed the door shut, muttering curses. "Must have been the wind," he said, but his voice was unsteady. Samantha backed away from the table, her eyes fixed on the Ouija board. The planchette was still moving, though no one was touching it. "Theyarrehere." "What the hell does that mean?" her father asked, his bravado cracking. A low, guttural moan echoed through the cabin. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. "Get the flashlights," her mother whispered, her voice trembling. Samantha couldn't move. She was frozen, her gaze locked on the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms. Something was there. A shadow, darker than the night, shifting and writhing like smoke. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Her family turned to look, and that was when it happened. The shadow lunged, stretching impossibly fast toward them. The air grew icy, and the moan turned into a deafening wail. "Run!" her father shouted, grabbing Jake and pushing him toward the back door. Samantha stumbled after them, her legs feeling like lead. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it, a scraping, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. They burst into the snow-covered yard, the storm battering them from all sides. Her father led them toward the truck, but Samantha stopped short. "Where's Mom?" she yelled over the wind. Her father turned, his face pale. "She was right behind us!" Samantha looked back at the cabin. The front door was open again, swinging wildly in the wind, and there, standing in the doorway, was her mother. "Mom!" she screamed, but something was wrong. Her mother's face was blank, her eyes staring straight ahead as if she couldn't see them. "Don't go back," her father warned, grabbing her arm, but Samantha wrenched free. "We can't leave her." She ran toward the cabin, the snow stinging her face. As she reached the porch, her mother stepped inside, disappearing into the darkness. "Mom, wait!" Samantha followed her into the cabin. the warmth of the fire long gone. The air inside was frigid and the shadows seemed to pulse and twist. "Mom," she called, her voice echoing strangely. Then she saw her. Her mother stood in the living room facing the fireplace. The Ouija board was back on the coffee table, the planchette spinning wildly on its own. "Mom, we have to go," Samantha pleaded, grabbing her arm. Her mother turned slowly and Samantha's blood ran cold. Her face was wrong, her features distorted, her eyes sunken and black. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, that same wailing moan erupted, shaking the walls. Samantha stumbled backward, tripping over the rug. The shadows surged toward her, and for a moment she thought she saw faces, twisted, screaming faces within them. "Sam!" Her father's voice cut through the chaos. He appeared in the doorway, holding a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam. "Get out!" he shouted, pulling her to her feet. They ran back into the storm, not stopping until they reached the truck. Jake was already inside, sobbing. Her father started the engine, and they sped down the icy road, the cabin disappearing behind them. Samantha didn't look back. They drove for hours, not stopping until they reached a motel on the outskirts of town. Only then did Samantha realize her mother wasn't with them. Her father tried to go back the next day, but the road to the cabin was blocked by fallen trees. When they finally returned in the spring, the cabin was empty. There was no sign of her mother or the Ouija board. Samantha never went back after that. Her family sold the cabin, and she tried to move on, but every New Year's Eve, she felt it, that same icy chill, that same sense of being watched. And sometimes when the wind howled just right, she swore she could hear it, the sound of her mother's voice calling her name.
Story number 2.
December 31st was never just another date for Paul. It was the anniversary of his brother Danny's disappearance, a night that had haunted him for the past 10 years. Danny had vanished without a trace during a New Year's Eve camping trip at Black Hollow Woods, leaving Paul and their friends to face a lifetime of unanswered questions. This year, Paul decided he couldn't live with the guilt any longer. He packed a small bag, grabbed a flashlight, and drove back to Black Hollow, determined to find closure. The town had grown used to the story of Danny's disappearance, a cautionary tale for those foolish enough to camp in the woods on New Year's Eve. The snow fell lightly as Paul parked his truck at the edge of the woods. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches bare and skeletal against the cloudy sky. With a deep breath, he stepped into the forest, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Paul retraced the path they had taken that night, a trail now overgrown and littered with fallen branches. Every step brought memories flooding back. Danny laughing as they toasted marshmallows, the group huddled around the fire, the eerie sound of the wind echoing through the trees. As he approached the clearing where they had set up camp, a strange feeling washed over him. The air seemed heavier, colder. His breath misted in front of him, and the snow on the ground looked untouched, as though no one had walked there in years. Paul scanned the area with his flashlight, half expecting to see the remnants of their old campsite. Instead, he found nothing, just an empty clearing, eerily quiet. No animals stirred, no wind rustled the branches. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it. A faint whisper carried on the cold air. "Paul?" He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned in a slow circle, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Danny?" he called, his voice barely more than a whisper. The sound came again, clearer this time. "Paul, help me." Panic set in, but so did a grim determination. He wasn't leaving until he knew the truth. He followed the voice, pushing through the dense underbrush. The whispers grew louder, guiding him deeper into the forest until he came to a tree he recognized. A massive oak with a gnarled trunk that they had marked with their initials years ago. As he approached, he saw something in the snow at its base. A tattered piece of cloth, half buried and frozen. Paul's breath hitched. It was the same blue flannel shirt Danny had been wearing the night he disappeared. Before he could process what he was seeing, the flashlight flickered, then died, plunging him into darkness. "Damn it!" Paul muttered, smacking the flashlight against his palm. But the batteries were dead, and the woods around him seemed to close in. "Paul?" The voice was right behind him now, so close he could feel the breath on his neck. He spun around, his eyes straining to see in the dark. The shadows seemed to shift and move, forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. "Danny, where are you?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm here." Paul turned again, and this time he saw him, or something that looked like him. Danny stood just a few feet away, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark hollows. His clothes were tattered, his skin stretched tight over his bones. "Danny?" Paul took a hesitant step forward. "You left me," Danny said, his voice low and hollow. "You let me die." Paul's stomach churned. "No, we searched for you. We called the police. We never stopped looking." Danny's expression twisted into something between a smile and a snarl. "You didn't look hard enough." The air grew colder, and Paul felt an invisible force pressing against him, pinning him in place. The shadows around Danny seemed to writhe and grow, stretching out like tendrils. "Danny, I'm sorry," Paul whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to leave you." Danny tilted his head, his hollow eyes boring into Paul's. "Do you want to know what happened?" Paul nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to run. Danny raised a skeletal hand and pointed to the base of the oak tree. The snow seemed to melt away, revealing a patch of frozen ground. Slowly, the earth began to shift, cracking open to reveal a shallow grave. Paul's knees buckled as he saw what lay within, a skeleton. Its bones twisted and broken, wearing the remains of a blue flannel shirt. "No," Paul whispered, shaking his head. "They took me," Danny said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "They dragged me here, and no one came for me." Paul looked up, his vision blurring with tears. Who? Who did this to you?" Danny's gaze shifted to the shadows, which now loomed like towering figures around them. "They did." The shadows surged forward, their shapes becoming more defined, tall, faceless beings with long, clawed hands. Paul tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat as one of the figures reached for him. "Paul, run," Danny said, his voice softer now, almost human. "Before it's too late." Paul didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and ran, the shadows closing in behind him. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as he sprinted toward the faint glow of his truck's headlights in the distance. He reached the truck, flinging the door open and collapsing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the snow-covered road without looking back. When he finally reached the safety of his home, Paul sat in his driveway, shaking uncontrollably. He knew he could never tell anyone what had happened. They would think he was crazy. But he also knew the truth. Danny's body was still there, buried beneath the oak tree. And whatever had taken him was still waiting in Black Hollow Woods, waiting for its next victim.
Story number 3.
December 31st, 1987 was the last time Sarah's family gathered in the old farmhouse. She was only 8 years old, but the events of that night had stayed with her, vivid and terrifying, even as she grew older. It had been meant as a celebration. Her parents, aunt, uncle, cousins, and grandmother ringing in the new year together. But by the time the sun rose on January 1st, the family would never return to the house. The farmhouse sat at the end of a desolate dirt road, surrounded by leafless trees and acres of barren fields. It had been in the family for generations, but it carried a dark history. Whispers of a curse followed it, stories of previous owners who had vanished, gone mad, or worse. Sarah's grandmother dismissed the rumors as superstition, insisting the house was perfectly safe. That night, as the adults played cards in the dining room and the children played hide and seek, the first odd thing happened. Sarah's cousin Tommy, who was a year older than her, ran back to the living room, his face pale. "Someone's upstairs," he whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah's mother glanced up from her hand of cards, frowning. "Don't be silly, Tommy. Everyone's down here." "No," Tommy insisted, pointing toward the staircase. "I saw a man. He was standing at the end of the hall." Her uncle chuckled nervously. "Probably your imagination. This old house creaks and groans all the time." But Tommy wouldn't let it go. Sarah saw the fear in his eyes and her stomach twisted. The adults dismissed him and went back to their game, but Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled over her. Later that evening, as the clock in the hall chimed 9, Sarah's grandmother lit the old oil lamp in the living room. "This lamp belonged to my father," she said, her voice nostalgic. "It's been in the family for decades." The lamp flickered to life, casting warm light across the room. But as Sarah watched, the flame wavered unnaturally, shrinking, growing, and turning a sickly green before finally stabilizing. "Must be a draft," her father said, though there were no windows open. The children were sent to bed shortly after, but Sarah couldn't sleep. The house felt alive, as though it was watching her. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind sent chills down her spine. It was nearly midnight when she heard it, a faint knocking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the walls. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. "Tommy?" she whispered, turning to the other bed in the room. But her cousin was fast asleep. The knocking grew louder, echoing through the house. Sarah crept to the door and peeked into the hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the oil lamp downstairs. She stepped into the hall, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The knocking seemed to be coming from everywhere, above her, below her, around her. She followed the sound down the stairs, her breath visible in the suddenly icy air. The living room was empty, the oil lamp still flickering on the table, but the knocking continued, louder now, coming from the front door. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah approached the door and reached for the knob. Before she could turn it, the knocking stopped. She froze, listening. The silence was deafening. Then from behind her she heard a whisper. "Sarah." She spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Sarah, help me!" She screamed, backing into the door. The sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs as her parents and the rest of the family rushed into the room. "What's going on?" her father demanded, his face pale. "There's someone here," Sarah cried, pointing toward the dark corners of the room. Her grandmother stepped forward, her expression grim. "We need to leave. Now." The adults exchanged nervous glances. "What are you talking about?" her uncle asked. "This house isn't safe," her grandmother said, her voice trembling. "I've known it for years, but I thought it wouldn't follow us. I was wrong." Before anyone could respond, the oil lamp flickered violently, the flame shooting up and then extinguishing itself. The room was plunged into darkness, and the knocking resumed, louder and more frantic than before. "Get to the car!" her grandmother shouted. They scrambled for their coats and shoes, the knocking now accompanied by the sound of shattering glass and the groan of the house's wooden beams. Sarah clung to her mother as they rushed out the front door into the freezing night. The family piled into their cars, but as her father turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. No, 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 he muttered, trying again and again, but the car wouldn't start. Behind them, the house seemed to come alive. Lights flickered in the windows, though no one had turned them on. Shadows moved inside, darting across the curtains. "Run to the road," her grandmother yelled. They abandoned the car, running through the snow toward the main road. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers and laughter, cold, mocking laughter. When they finally reached the road, they flagged down a passing truck. The driver, a grizzled old man, took one look at their terrified faces and didn't ask questions. He drove them into town, dropping them off at the nearest motel. The next morning, Sarah's father and uncle returned to the farmhouse to collect their things. They found the house dark and silent, but the living room was in shambles. The oil lamp lay shattered on the floor, and deep scratches marred the walls. They didn't stay long. The family sold the farmhouse soon after, though no one stayed in it for long. Over the years, Sarah heard rumors of new owners fleeing in the middle of the night, of strange noises and unexplained events. Sarah grew up, but she never forgot that night. Every December 31st, she felt an inexplicable chill, as though the house was still watching her, waiting for her to return. She never did.
Story number 4.
December 31st, 1999 was supposed to be a night of celebration. The world was on edge with Y2K paranoia, but for Alex, Emma, and their friends, it was an excuse to throw one last party before the new millennium. The group decided to rent an old manor on the outskirts of town. It was cheap, spacious, and perfect for a New Year's Eve bash. The manor was ancient, its stone walls weathered and ivy-covered. Locals called it Hollowmere House and warned against spending the night there. Supposedly, something terrible had happened there decades ago, but the details were murky. A fire, a disappearance, a haunting. Alex dismissed the stories as small-town gossip, and the group moved in with bags of snacks, a portable stereo, and a cooler full of drinks. The evening started off festive. Music blared from the living room, and everyone danced, laughed, and shouted over one another. By 10 p.m., the manor's eerie atmosphere was all but forgotten. Then the power went out. It started with the lights flickering, a strange buzzing sound coming from the ancient wiring. The music cut off abruptly, plunging the house into a silence broken only by their startled laughter. "Great," Alex muttered, fiddling with his flashlight. "Y2K strikes early." "Relax," Emma said, lighting a candle. "It's just old wiring. Let's make it spooky. We're in a creepy old house, right?" Her suggestion was met with a mix of cheers and nervous laughter. They spread out, lighting candles in every room, and gathered in the living room to tell ghost stories. It was nearing midnight when Emma noticed something strange. The room had grown colder, so cold she could see her breath. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the others. "Is anyone else freezing?" she asked. Before anyone could respond, the grandfather clock in the corner began to chime. "Is that clock working?" Alex asked, frowning. "I thought it was broken." "It's been silent all night," Emma said. "Why is it working now?" The clock continued to chime, slow and deliberate. It struck 12 times, but the group noticed something unnerving. It was only 11:30. A nervous silence fell over them, broken by the sound of footsteps above their heads. Everyone froze. "Did someone go upstairs?" Alex asked, his voice low. "No one's been up there," Emma said, her eyes wide. The footsteps grew louder, moving across the floor above them, heading toward the staircase. "We're not alone," one of their friends whispered. Alex grabbed the flashlight and stood. "I'll check it out." Emma grabbed his arm. "Don't be an idiot. What if someone's actually up there?" "That's why I'm going," Alex said, though his voice betrayed his fear. "I'll just take a look. Maybe it's an animal or something." Reluctantly, the group followed him to the base of the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under Alex's weight as he climbed, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called. His voice echoed down the hall. The upstairs was eerily silent, the air heavy and still. Alex checked each room, finding nothing but dusty furniture and cobwebs. Just as he was about to head back down, the flashlight flickered. "Great," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. The light went out entirely, plunging him into darkness. He felt a cold draft brush past him, and then he heard it, a faint whisper. "Leave." Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave now." He turned and ran, nearly tripping over his feet as he bolted down the stairs. "Alex, what happened?" Emma asked, her voice panicked. "Something's up there," he gasped. "We need to leave, now." Before they could react, the door to the basement slammed open with a deafening bang. The group screamed, backing away from the dark stairwell. A foul smell wafted up from below like rotting meat and damp earth. "We're leaving," Emma shouted, grabbing her coat. They rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they pulled or twisted the lock, it refused to open. "We're trapped," one of their friends cried. The candles flickered violently, their flames turning an unnatural shade of green. Shadows danced on the walls, growing taller and more distorted. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the basement doorway, its shape barely human. It was hunched and twisted, its limbs impossibly long. Its face was a gaping void, blacker than the darkest shadow. The group screamed, scattering in all directions. Alex grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen, hoping to find another way out. "What is that thing?" Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Alex yelled. They reached the back door, but it was locked as well. The windows wouldn't open, no matter how hard they pushed. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was savoring their terror. Its whispers filled the air, incomprehensible and maddening. "We have to try the windows upstairs," Alex said, pulling Emma toward the staircase. They climbed to the second floor, the others following close behind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was speaking to them. "Don't look back," Alex told Emma, his voice trembling. They reached a bedroom and threw open the window. The freezing night air rushed in and Alex helped Emma climb onto the ledge. "Jump," he urged. One by one, they leapt from the window into the snow-covered yard below. Alex was the last to go, his heart pounding as he glanced back. The figure stood in the doorway, its head tilted as though watching him. He jumped, landing hard on the frozen ground. The group ran to the main road. not stopping until they were far from the house. They flagged down a passing car, and the driver took them to town. No one spoke of what they had seen, and when they returned the next day to retrieve their belongings, the house was quiet and undisturbed. But the memory of that night lingered, a dark shadow that none of them could shake. Years later, Hollowmere House still stands, abandoned and decaying. Locals say the whispers can still be heard on cold December nights, and the figure still waits in the shadows, watching for its next visitors. Story the end.
Story number 5.
December 31st had always been a special night for Lily and her family. Every year they gathered at the family cabin deep in the snowy woods to ring in the new year. The cabin, built by her great-grandfather in the 1940s, had no Wi-Fi or cell reception, but that was part of its charm. This year, however, was different. It was the first New Year's Eve without her grandmother, who had passed away the previous spring. The family thought a trip to the cabin might help them feel close to her again. The drive up was uneventful, though the snowfall was heavier than usual. By the time Lily, her parents, and her younger brother Jake arrived, the woods were blanketed in thick snow, and the temperature had plummeted. They unloaded the car quickly, eager to get inside and start a fire. The cabin was just as Lily remembered, cozy but worn, with its creaky wooden floors and the smell of pine lingering in the air. Her grandmother's rocking chair still sat by the fireplace, untouched since her last visit. The family settled in, playing board games and reminiscing about past New Year's celebrations. As the hours ticked by, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. The snowstorm was worsening, but inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, and everything felt safe. Around 10:30 p.m., Lily went outside to grab more firewood. The cold hit her like a slap, and the wind made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. She hurried to the woodpile, stacking a few logs in her arms, when something caught her eye, a faint light flickering in the woods. Probably just another cabin, she muttered to herself. But as she turned to head back inside, she realized something strange. The nearest cabin was miles away. She froze, staring into the darkness. The light flickered again, closer this time, and with it came a sound, a faint, mournful wail. "Lily," her mother called from the doorway, startling her. She turned quickly. "Yeah, I'm coming." Inside, she shook off the strange feeling. It was probably just the wind playing tricks on her, she reasoned. But as the clock approached midnight, Lily couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Jake was the first to notice something odd. "Mom, why is the rocking chair moving?" They all turned to look. The chair by the fireplace, which had been still all evening, was now swaying gently back and forth. "It's just the draft," their father said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Draft or not, I'm moving it," Jake said, getting up. "No," Lily's mother snapped, startling everyone. She softened her tone and added, "That was your grandma's favorite chair. Just leave it." Jake shrugged and sat back down, but the tension in the room was palpable. At 11:45 p.m., the power went out. "Perfect," Jake muttered. "Don't worry," their father said, lighting a few candles. "We've got the fireplace. It'll keep us warm until the power comes back." But Lily wasn't worried about the cold. Something about the darkness felt wrong. The flickering candlelight cast strange shadows on the walls, and the howling wind outside sounded almost like voices. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Her mother asked. "Voices. Outside." Jake laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." "No," Lily insisted. "It sounds like someone's calling for help." Her father frowned. "Nobody's out there in this storm. It's dangerous." But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, crying out faintly. "Help me." Lily's mother stood abruptly, her face pale. "It sounds like..." "Grandma," Jake finished, his eyes wide. The family stared at one another, unsure of what to do. Then the knocking started. It was soft at first, coming from the front door. "Who on earth could that be?" their father asked, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't open it," Lily blurted out, panic rising in her chest. "Why not?" "Just don't." The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Please let me in," the voice outside pleaded. "It's her," Lily's mother whispered, tears in her eyes. "It's my mother." "That's impossible," their father said, though his voice wavered. The knocking stopped, and the cabin fell silent. Then the back door slammed open. The wind howled into the cabin, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Lily grabbed Jake's hand, her heart racing. "Stay together," their father said, his voice firm. But the darkness was overwhelming, and in it came the voice again, louder now. "Help me, please." A shadow moved across the room, and the rocking chair began to sway violently. The air grew colder, and the smell of pine was replaced by something foul, rotting and sour. "Get out!" the voice screamed, no longer pleading but furious. The family bolted for the front door, their fear overcoming their paralysis. Outside, the storm raged, but they didn't care. They ran through the snow, stumbling and falling until they reached the car. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the icy road without looking back. When they reached the nearest town, they huddled in the warmth of a diner, too shaken to speak. It wasn't until much later that Lily's mother finally broke the silence. "That wasn't her," she said softly. "What do you mean?" Lily asked. Her mother stared out the window, her expression haunted. "Whatever was in that cabin, it wasn't my mother. The family never returned to the cabin. They sold it the following spring, but no one stayed there for long. Stories began to circulate of strange voices, freezing cold, and a rocking chair that wouldn't stop moving no matter what. And every December 31st, Lily couldn't help but wonder who or what had been knocking on their door that night. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Here's a haunting tale set on December 31st. Snow blanketed the quiet streets of Brookhaven that New Year's Eve. The tiny town had always been the kind of place where nothing remarkable happened, where the passage of time felt like a slow drift. But for Clara Hayes, the night of December 31 was one she never forgot. Clara had moved back to her childhood home after her mother's passing earlier that year. It was an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, its pointed gables and peeling paint giving it an eerie charm. She hadn't spent a New Year's Eve there since she was a teenager, and as the wind howled through the bare trees, the memories of her youth began to creep back. She'd never been able to shake the feeling that the house carried an unseen weight, a heaviness that settled in the silence. Her mother used to dismiss her fears with a wave of her hand. "Old houses creak," she'd say. "That's all." But Clara knew it was more than that. There were the faint whispers in the attic, the shadowy figure she thought she saw at the end of the hallway, and the way the air turned cold in certain rooms without explanation. That night, Clara was alone. Her only company was the persistent ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. She had decided against a celebration. Her heart wasn't in it. Instead, she curled up on the couch with a blanket, a cup of tea, and an old book she'd found in her mother's collection. The clock read 11:32 p.m. As she turned the pages, the house seemed quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath. Then she heard it, a faint tapping. It was soft, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the dining room. Her stomach tightened. She told herself it was just the wind rattling the windows, but as she listened, the tapping grew louder. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, almost like a knock. Clara set her book aside and rose to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. She hesitated before stepping into the hallway. The dining room door was ajar, and beyond it the shadows seemed thicker, darker. She reached for the light switch, but when she flipped it, nothing happened. The power was out. Clara's breath came in short bursts as she fumbled for her phone to use its flashlight. She shone the light into the dining room, revealing the long, empty table her mother had cherished. The room was still, too still. Then she saw it, a handprint on the frosted window. It was large, smudged, and unlike anything she'd ever seen. It wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone's. The print was strange, the fingers elongated, almost claw-like. Clara backed away, her pulse racing. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from upstairs. She froze, staring at the staircase. The sound was louder now, echoing through the house. Each knock reverberated in her chest like a heartbeat. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara took the first step up the creaking staircase. The air grew colder with each step, her breath visible in the dim glow of her flashlight. When she reached the landing, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. She shone the light down the hallway, at the beam trembling in her unsteady hand. Her mother's room was at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but from beneath it a faint light flickered. Clara's knees nearly buckled. That room had been locked since the funeral, and she didn't have the key. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice quivering. No response. She inched forward, her legs like lead. As she reached the door, the light flickered again, and she noticed something carved into the wood. It hadn't been there before. 4 words etched deep into the surface. "Remember what you did." Clara's stomach churned. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the doorknob. To her shock, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural, pale glow. The room was empty, except for a single item, a music box sitting on her mother's old dresser. It was open, the delicate melody of Auld Lang Syne playing faintly. Clara hadn't seen that music box in years. Her mother used to wind it every New Year's Eve when Clara was a child. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her. The sound jolted her, and when she spun around, the room was no longer empty. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its head tilted at an odd angle. Clara's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in near darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The figure didn't move. Instead, a voice echoed through the room, low and guttural, yet somehow familiar. "You forgot, didn't you?" Clara's chest tightened. The words on the door flashed in her mind. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. The figure stepped closer, the shadows peeling away to reveal a face she recognized all too well, her own. But it wasn't right. The doppelganger's eyes were hollow, its skin pale and cracked, as if it were made of porcelain. It smiled, a chilling grin that stretched too wide. "You left me," it said, its voice layered with agony and malice. "You left me to die." Clara stumbled backward, her mind reeling. Memories she had buried deep began to resurface. She was 16, it was New Year's Eve, and she and her sister, Emily, had sneaked out of the house. They'd gone to a party, drunk more than they should have, and on the way home, their car had skidded on the icy road. Emily had been trapped in the wreckage, begging Clara for help, but Clara had panicked. She'd fled into the night, leaving her sister behind. By the time rescuers arrived, it was too late. "No," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to." The figure's grin widened. "You let me freeze," it hissed. "And now, you'll join me." The temperature in the room plummeted, and Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. She turned to flee, but the door wouldn't budge. The figure was on her now, its icy hands gripping her shoulders, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. The music box played faster, its melody warped and discordant. The room spun, and Clara's screams were swallowed by the cold. The next morning, when the neighbors noticed Clara hadn't picked up her newspaper, they called the police. Officers found her in her mother's bedroom, lying on the floor with the music box still playing softly. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her lips blue and her skin cold to the touch. On the door, the words were gone, but the handprint on the dining room window remained, a chilling reminder of what had happened that night. And every year, on December 31st, passersby claimed to hear faint whispers coming from the old Victorian house, as if someone, or something, is still waiting for Clara to come back.
Story number 7.
The little town of Hollow Pines was famous for its extravagant New Year's Eve celebrations. Fireworks painted the sky, music filled the streets, and laughter echoed through the frosty air. But for Alex Carter, the night carried a darker reputation. People in town spoke of the Midnight Visitor, a shadowy figure that was said to appear every December 31st, moments before the clock struck 12. Alex wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. After all, she was a journalist, a woman of facts and evidence. But the legend intrigued her. It had started years ago with vague accounts of people seeing someone, something, standing in their windows at midnight. Those who claimed to have seen it said it was more than just a person. Its figure seemed warped, its presence oppressive, and worst of all, anyone who saw the visitor never spoke of what happened next. Determined to unravel the mystery, Alex decided to spend this New Year's Eve at the Old Crawford Estate, an abandoned mansion on the edge of town. It was a dilapidated, sprawling place, and according to the stories, the visitor was most often seen there. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, Alex arrived at the estate just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house loomed before her, its windows like empty eye sockets, its peeling walls covered in ivy. The air was unnaturally cold, and the wind carried a faint whistle that sounded almost like a mournful cry. Alex pushed open the creaking front door, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Inside, the house was exactly as she'd imagined. Dusty furniture draped in white sheets, a grand staircase leading to darkness above, and cobwebs that hung like curtains in every corner. She set up her camera in the living room, pointing it toward a cracked mirror that was rumored to show the visitor's reflection. Then she settled into an old armchair to wait. The hours passed slowly. Alex alternated between jotting notes and sipping from her thermos of coffee. The house was quiet, save for the occasional groan of its wooden frame. At 11:45 p.m., her flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out. She tapped it, annoyed, but the light returned to full strength. That's when she heard it. Faint footsteps overhead. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her flashlight and camera, aiming the beam at the ceiling. The sound grew louder, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth directly above her. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor above echoed through the house. Alex clenched her jaw, forcing herself to move. She climbed the staircase, the boards creaking beneath her boots. Each step felt like a leap into the unknown. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched into darkness. The dragging sound was louder now, coming from the last door on the left. Her flashlight flickered again, and the cold was so biting that her breath puffed out in clouds. She pushed open the door to find an empty room. The walls were bare, the floor coated in a thick layer of dust. But in the center of the room was a single chair, tipped over on its side. Next to it, a deep groove was carved into the floorboards, as if the chair had been dragged across the room. Alex's camera beeped, drawing her attention. She looked down and saw that it had begun recording on its own. The screen displayed nothing but static, but in the midst of the white noise, a faint, distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down her spine. She swung the flashlight around, but the room remained empty. Then she felt it, a presence behind her. The air grew heavy, pressing against her back like an invisible weight. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her camera screen went black, and the flashlight died completely. She was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the flashlight, slapping it against her palm. A spark of light returned, illuminating the chair. But now it was upright, and in it sat a figure. It was human-like, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head too large, and its skin glistened as if it were wet. Its eyes were empty sockets, yet Alex could feel its gaze piercing her. It grinned, revealing teeth that were jagged and yellowed. The voice from the camera whispered again, but this time it came from the creature itself. "You wanted to see me, didn't you?" Alex stumbled back, tripping over the threshold. She scrambled to her feet and ran the hallway, her footsteps echoing like gunshots. The creature didn't chase her, but she could feel its presence growing stronger, as if the entire house were alive with it. She burst into the living room just as the grandfather clock struck midnight. The chimes reverberated through the house, drowning out everything else. Her camera was still sitting on the table where she'd left it, the lens pointed at the mirror. And in the mirror, she saw it. The creature stood directly behind her. Its face was inches from hers, its grin wider, more menacing. She screamed and spun around, but nothing was there. The mirror cracked, splintering into a web of fractures. The camera beeped again, its screen showing only a single word before it powered off. "Stay!" Alex fled the house, leaving her equipment behind. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. When she finally looked in the rearview mirror, the creature's reflection was there, sitting in the back seat. She never made it home. The next morning, the police found her car abandoned at the edge of the woods. The driver's seat was empty, the keys still in the ignition. The only clue was her camera, sitting on the passenger seat. When they reviewed the footage, all they saw was static. But as they watched, the static shifted. For a brief moment, the screen displayed a face, warped, grinning, and watching. From that year on, the stories of the Midnight Visitor only grew. And every December 31st, the Crawford estate remained eerily quiet, as if the house itself were waiting for its next guest. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The wind howled through the bare branches outside the old Rosenfield Manor, a sprawling estate on the edge of a small New England town. The mansion, long abandoned, had a reputation for being cursed. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the events of December 31st, 1923, when the entire Rosenfield family vanished without a trace during a grand New Year's Eve ball. No one had dared enter the house since. Well, no one except thrill seekers, and none of them had ever returned. But tonight, Claire Thompson was determined to break the cycle. She was an urban explorer with a fascination for haunted places, and she was live streaming her visit for her growing online audience. She was alone, armed with only a flashlight, her phone, and a backpack of supplies. The night was cold, her breath fogging as she approached the imposing structure. "This is it," Claire said, her voice steady as she addressed her viewers. "Rosenfield Manor. Nearly a century of mystery. Let's see if the stories are true." The heavy front door creaked open with surprising ease, revealing a grand foyer frozen in time. Dust coated the marble floors and cobwebs draped the crystal chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. Claire's flashlight flickered as she panned it around the room. "So far, no ghosts," she joked, though the unease in her voice was evident. She moved cautiously, narrating her exploration. The house seemed untouched since that fateful night in 1923. Tables were still set with silverware, and a thick layer of dust coated the remains of a grand feast. A broken champagne flute lay near the fireplace, its shards glinting in the pale light. "Creepy, right?" she said, glancing at the chat on her phone. Her audience was buzzing with excitement and warnings to be careful. Claire climbed the grand staircase, the steps groaning beneath her weight. The upper level was even darker, the long hallway lined with closed doors. At the end of the hall stood a single door, slightly ajar. The faint sound of music drifted from within. She froze. Her chat exploded with comments. "Did anyone else hear that? There's no way she's going in there." But Claire was nothing if not bold. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and pushed the door open. Inside was a massive ballroom. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine. The chandeliers sparkled and the air was warm, filled with the lilting notes of a piano. But there was no piano player and no electricity to power the lights. Okay, Claire said, her voice trembling as she stepped inside. Her phone camera captured the eerie glow of the room, and her viewers urged her to leave. The temperature dropped suddenly. Her breath fogged in front of her, and the music grew louder, more distorted. The chandelier flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Then she saw them. Figures in elegant 1920s attire filled the room, their faces pale and expressionless. They moved in perfect synchronization, gliding across the floor in a ghostly waltz. Claire's heart pounded as she tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. One of the figures turned toward her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as it raised a hand, beckoning her to join. "Nope, nope, nope," Claire muttered, forcing her legs to move. She turned to run, but the ballroom doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Her flashlight flickered again and went out, leaving her in near darkness. Her phone's screen provided the only light, and she could see the chat going wild. Messages blurred together as her audience begged her to get out. The figures were closing in now, their movements slow but deliberate. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she frantically tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the wood. A voice whispered behind her, soft and chilling. "Stay. Dance with us." She spun around, her flashlight sputtering back to life for a brief moment. In that fleeting beam of light, she saw a man standing inches from her. He wore a tattered tuxedo, his eyes sunken and lifeless, his skin gray and cracked. His hand reached out, icy and skeletal, brushing her arm. Claire shrieked, dropping her phone. The screen shattered and her live stream cut to static. The ballroom fell silent. The figures stopped moving, their heads snapping toward Claire in unison. One by one, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the darkness. The warmth of the room vanished, replaced by an all-encompassing chill. And then everything went black. The next day, Claire's followers reported her disappearance. Local authorities searched the manor but found no trace of her. The house was as empty and lifeless as it had been for decades. The only clue was her phone, lying in the middle of the ballroom floor, its screen frozen on the last image captured by her camera, a blurred, grinning face looming over her shoulder. From that night on, Claire became part of the legend. They say if you visit Rosenfield Manor on December 31st and stand in the ballroom, you might hear faint whispers or the haunting notes of a piano. And if you're unlucky, you might even see a figure in modern clothing, her terrified eyes pleading for help as she swept into an eternal waltz. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The cabin had always been a family retreat. Nestled in the woods, far from the chaos of city life, it was a place where the Reeds could escape to every year to spend the holiday together. It was isolated with no neighbors for miles, and despite its age and creaky floorboards, it felt like home. This year, however, things were different. Sarah, her husband Tom, and their 2 children, Olivia and Ben, arrived at the cabin late on December 31st, 2007, after a long drive through the thickening snowstorm. They were tired but excited to ring in the new year in peace and solitude. The holiday had been bittersweet that year, their first without Sarah's mother, who had passed away just a few months earlier. Still, they hoped the trip would help bring some joy into their lives. When they arrived, the snow was falling heavily, blanketing the ground in a thick white layer. The cabin looked exactly as it always had, old but charming with its wooden beams and stone fireplace. They unpacked quickly and started a fire to warm up the place, then settled in with hot cocoa and a few board games. As the night wore on, the snowstorm outside intensified. The wind howled through the trees and the world outside seemed to disappear into the white darkness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but they made the best of it, celebrating quietly. Tom checked the clock. It was nearly midnight. "We should step outside for a moment," Sarah said, looking at her husband, "to see the snow and maybe make a wish for the new year." Tom nodded and wrapped a scarf around his neck. He pulled on his boots and went out to join Sarah on the porch. Ben and Olivia stayed inside, eager to stay warm and play their final round of Monopoly for the evening. Sarah stood still in the deepening snow, letting the cold air and the quietness of the night fill her lungs. The storm had become so thick that she couldn't see the driveway anymore, and the cabin looked like a faint shadow in the middle of a vast white field. "I always loved it here," she murmured. Tom smiled. "Me too." He gazed up at the sky. "It's so still, almost like we're the only ones left in the world." Sarah chuckled softly, but then something caught her eye. Out in the woods, just past the line of trees, there was a faint light, barely visible through the snow. It flickered for a moment like a lantern. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but urgent. Tom turned to look in the same direction. "A light? That's odd. There's no one out here for miles." "I swear, it looked like a lantern. Maybe someone's lost?" Tom frowned. "I don't know. It's way too dangerous out there to be walking around, especially in a storm like this. Let's go back inside." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The light had been too clear, too real. She watched it for a few more moments, but the snowstorm had grown thicker, obscuring her view. "We should check," Sarah said again, her heart pounding. "No, let's go in." "We're not doing anyone any good by standing out here," Tom said, gently pulling her back toward the door. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. They stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, but the unease lingered with Sarah. The children were now watching TV, and Tom was fussing with the fire. As the clock struck midnight, the mood lightened, and the family exchanged smiles and hugs, celebrating the new year. But Sarah could not shake the odd feeling that something wasn't quite right. Something had been off with the light in the woods, something she couldn't explain. The next morning, as the family enjoyed breakfast, the storm had finally subsided, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine snow. After they finished their meal, Tom suggested a walk. "Let's get some fresh air. It'll do us good to stretch our legs." They bundled up and went outside, the sun low and glinting off the snow. The air was crisp, but the world felt still, too still. As they walked along the snow-covered trail through the woods, Sarah found herself gazing toward the same spot where she had seen the light the night before. "Do you see anything over there?" Sarah asked. Tom followed her gaze but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "What do you mean?" "There," she pointed. "Last night there was something out there, a light." He frowned, but then he shrugged. It's probably just a trick of the snow. Let's not worry about it. It's probably just a car passing by or something. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about it. The light had seemed so real, so purposeful. As they walked further into the woods, they noticed something odd. There, partially hidden in the snow, was a small wooden lantern, its frame battered and old. It was half buried under the snow, its faint glow still flickering dimly. Tom knelt down to pick it up, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. "That's strange," he muttered. "Where did this come from?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," he said, looking around. "There's no way this could have been here last night, Ma. The snow was too thick for anyone to walk through it, let alone leave something behind." Sarah took a step back. A strange feeling came over her, an overwhelming sense of dread. The lantern had been here for far too long. "I don't like this," she whispered. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, and a low, eerie sound carried through the trees. It was a faint, hollow voice, like a whispering breath. Sarah turned sharply, but there was no one there. "Did you hear that?" she asked, gripping Tom's arm. "I heard it," he said, his voice tight. They hurried back toward the cabin, the strange unease growing with each step. That night, after dinner, they all sat around the fire. Ben and Olivia were playing a game, but Sarah couldn't focus. Every time she glanced toward the window, she thought she saw a faint light flickering in the woods. By midnight, the storm was returning, but the eerie feeling lingered in the cabin. Sarah couldn't explain it, but she felt as though something was watching them. At exactly 12:30 a.m., they heard it, a knock at the door. Tom stood up quickly, his eyes darting toward the door. Who could that be? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It's too late for anyone to be out here. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was standing just outside. Tom hesitated, but then opened the door. There was nothing there, just the cold, empty woods stretching into the distance. When he stepped outside to check, Sarah heard the faintest sound, a whisper that carried on the wind. "Help me." Tom turned back toward the cabin. It's nothing, just the wind. But Sarah knew. They never stayed at the cabin again. The lantern was never explained, and the whispers never ceased. Every year on December 31st, the sound of that knock would haunt Sarah's mind, and she would always wonder who or what had been calling to them from the woods.
Story number 10.
The town of Black Hollow was known for many things. Its historic landmarks, its proximity to the forest, and its chilling winters. But most famous of all was its legend, one that resurfaced every December 31st without fail. The story was about the Midnight Girl. It all began nearly a century ago with a young girl named Lily Finch, the daughter of the town's wealthiest family. Lily was beautiful, kind, and well-loved by everyone, but she had a secret, a dark secret that no one knew. She had fallen in love with a man from the wrong side of town, a poor farmer named Samuel. Their love was forbidden by her family, and they met in secret for months. But on one cold December night, Lily's father found out. In a fit of rage, he locked Lily in her room, forbidding her to see Samuel again. But she had made a plan. On the night of the New Year's Eve ball, when the clock struck midnight, she would escape the manor and run away with Samuel. Lily didn't make it. On that fateful night, just as the clock began to toll, Lily made her way to the window of her room. She was ready to climb down the trellis to the ground below and meet Samuel at the edge of the woods. But as she reached the windowsill, her father found her. He rushed forward and pulled her back into the room, demanding she never see that man again. But Lily didn't listen. In desperation, she leaped from the window, hoping to make a break for freedom. She fell to the ground, but her dress caught on the trellis, and she was impaled on the sharp branches, her life slipping away as she screamed in the snow. Her body was found the next morning, but Samuel was never seen again. The town mourned her loss, but they whispered too about the strange happenings that began after her death. People reported seeing a young girl dressed in white, standing by the edge of the woods near the manor, her eyes full of longing and sorrow. And when midnight struck on December 31st, there was always a soft knock on the door of the Finch Manor, though no one ever stood outside. Rachel Thompson had heard the story all her life. She grew up in Black Hollow, but she had always dismissed the legend of the Midnight Girl as a story made up to scare children. Yet this year she felt a strange pull to the legend. Something inside her wanted to know if the stories were true, if Lily Finch's ghost truly haunted the manor. It was December 31st, and Rachel found herself standing outside the crumbling Finch Manor, the same house where Lily's life had ended. The snow fell in thick, soft flakes, covering the town in a peaceful blanket, but the air was heavy with anticipation. Rachel had spent the evening with friends at a nearby pub, but when midnight drew closer, she excused herself, telling them she wanted to see the old manor before the new year began. The town square was empty, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots. She stood before the manor gates, the iron bars twisted and rusted with age. The windows were dark, lifeless, but something about the place made her heart race, and she couldn't quite explain why. She pushed the gates open, stepping into the overgrown garden that had once been meticulously manicured. Vines crawled up the stone walls, and the air felt colder here, colder than it had in the town center. The wind whispered and the trees swayed, casting long shadows across the ground. Rachel made her way to the front door, which was slightly ajar. She hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by an overwhelming sense of curiosity, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was just as it had been described, decaying, forgotten, and filled with an oppressive stillness. Dust covered everything, and the wooden floors creaked beneath her every step. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating faded portraits of the Finch family, their eyes staring down at her. She reached the grand staircase, its railing cracked and splintered, and began to climb. As she reached the top, she heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper coming from the direction of the master bedroom. Rachel froze. It was a soft, delicate sound, like the rustling of a dress. She didn't know what to make of it, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She knew she shouldn't go any further, but something pulled her forward. When she reached the door to the master bedroom, it creaked open as if inviting her inside. She stepped through, her heart racing, and the first thing she saw was the window, wide open with the trellis below, just like in the story. And there, in the corner of the room, was a figure. A girl dressed in a long white gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her back turned toward Rachel. She stood motionless, her hands clasped at her side. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be, but the girl's presence was undeniable. She was real. "Lily?" Rachel whispered, almost afraid to speak. The girl's head snapped around, her eyes wide with sorrow, her expression vacant. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, an overwhelming feeling of dread filled the room. The temperature plummeted, and the soft glow of Rachel's flashlight flickered and died. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Rachel turned, frantic, but the figure moved closer, gliding toward her, its feet not touching the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest as the girl reached out, her icy fingers brushing against Rachel's arm. "Leave," the girl whispered, in a voice that was both soft and hollow. "Leave before the clock strikes 12. Rachel's mind spun as she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thick, suffocating. She felt the cold, the fear, the longing of the girl before her. The clock outside the room began to toll. 1, 2, 3. With each chime, the figure drew closer. "I didn't mean to die," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to leave him. I just wanted to be free." The chimes grew louder, and Rachel's panic intensified. She had to get out. But then the door opened on its own. She rushed through, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. She ran down the staircase, her footsteps echoing in the empty house, the clock still tolling behind her. Just as the last chime sounded, she burst through the front door into the night. The snow had stopped falling, and the town was eerily still. Rachel didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the town, her legs burning, her mind spinning with the image of the girl in white. The Midnight Girl. She never returned to the Finch Manor, and as she told her friends what had happened that night, the legend of the Midnight Girl continued to haunt Black Hollow. And every year, as the clock strikes midnight on December 31st, there are whispers on the wind, and someone always hears a soft knock on the door of the old Finch Manor. Story the end.